welcome back to Golo Nightmare. Tonight's story is another terrifying journey into the dark. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen carefully. The first thing you learn about Garnett, Oklahoma, if you marry into it the way I did, is that the sirens go off every Saturday at noon and nobody flinches. The first few weeks I lived here, I'd be standing in the kitchen with a coffee, and the whole sky would start to scream. That long rising wail that in any movie means run, and I'd freeze with my mug halfway to my mouth, and Theo would just keep buttering his toast. "It's the test," he'd say, without looking up. Noon on Saturday, they've done it since before I was born, and sure enough the wail would climb and hold and fall, and the birds would settle back into the pecan tree out front, and the morning would go on like nothing had happened because nothing had. That's the thing I want you to hold on to before I tell you the rest of it, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to say. In Garnett, the sound of the worst thing that can happen to you is also the most ordinary sound of the week. You hear it so often that you stop being able to tell the difference between a test and a warning. You just trust that someone, somewhere, knows which one it is, and you butter your toast. My name is Wren. Technically Wendy Okafor Hale, but nobody's called me Wendy since my mother, and my mother's been gone 6 years now. I'm 33. I grew up in Tulsa, an hour and change east, which to people in Garnett might as well be a different country. I met Theo Hale at a friend's wedding when I was 28, and I married him at 30, and I moved out here to his hometown because he had a good job at the co-op and roots that went down 4 generations, and I had a job I could do from a laptop and roots that didn't go down anywhere at all. My father raised me alone after my mother left, and then he died when I was 27 quietly of a heart that just stopped one Tuesday, and I have no brothers or sisters. And what I'm telling you is that when I came to Garnett, I came starving. I'd spent my whole life being the one who showed up. I was the friend who organized the meal train when somebody had a baby. I was the one with the spare key, the one who drove you to the colonoscopy, the one who remembered the anniversary of the bad thing and texted you on the right day. I gave, and I told myself that was love. And some nights, the honest ones, I knew that what I was really doing was buying my way toward a belonging I'd never once been handed for free. So when Garnett opened up to me, when Patrice took my face in her 2 warm hands the first Thanksgiving and called me her daughter, I cried in the bathroom afterward. I want to be honest about how much I wanted in. I think the wanting is the whole story. I think the wanting is the door I walked through, and I walked through it smiling. Garnett is not a dying town, and it is not a spooky town, and I need you to picture it correctly, or none of this will land the way it landed on me. It has a Sonic out by the highway where the high schoolers sit on their tailgates on Friday nights. It has a Dollar General and a real grocery store and a Methodist church with a white steeple and a Baptist church with a bigger parking lot, and the two of them have a softball rivalry that people take more seriously than I have ever taken anything. It has a square with a war memorial and a gazebo nobody uses except for the 4th of July. In the spring, the whole place smells like cut grass because everyone mows on Saturday, and underneath the cut grass, when the weather turns, there's this other smell, a green, sharp electric smell that comes in off the plains ahead of a storm, ozone and rain and crushed stems all at once. And out here, people love that smell. They breathe it in on their porches. It means the heat's about to break. It means rain for the wheat. The first spring I lived here, Patrice stood on her front step with her eyes closed and said, "Smell that, Wren. Isn't that just the best smell in the world?" And I agreed, because it was, and because agreeing with Patrice felt like being let into a warm house. Remember that smell. I'm going to bring it back. By the end, you'll feel about it the way I do now, which is that I can't be near a freshly mowed lawn before a rain without my hands starting to shake. The shelter is under the old Town Hall Annex, which is a low brick building on the corner of 2nd and Cedar. That used to be the town hall back in the 40s and is now mostly used for the food pantry and the quilting guild, and the kind of meetings where folding chairs get set up in rows. The shelter itself is older than the building on top of it, or that's how it feels when you go down. The annex is brick and plaster, but the shelter is poured concrete, a WPA job from the Depression, with the date stamped into the floor at the bottom of the stairs, 1938, the year carved by some workman who is long dead now and whose name is probably in the notebook too, somewhere on the early pages, in pencil so old it's gone silver. You go down a flight of concrete steps and the temperature drops 10 degrees and the daylight gives up about halfway down, and then you're in a long, low room with a curved ceiling like the inside of a culvert, benches bolted to both walls, a single bare bulb on a cord, a battery lantern on a shelf for when the power goes, and at the far end a hand-crank ventilation fan in a metal housing that somebody has to turn during a long shelter so the air doesn't go stale. There's room down there for maybe 60 people sitting close. The whole north side of the neighborhood comes here when it's bad. The houses on Cedar and Second and Magnolia don't have their own shelters, most of them, because why would you dig your own when the town keeps this one stocked and swept and ready? That's the word people use. Ready. The shelter's always ready. Patrice sees to it. I met the shelter properly on a community clean-out day in March, my third spring in town, which is where this whole thing really starts, even though I didn't know it. Twice a year, the neighborhood gathers on a Saturday morning to air the place out, check the supplies, sweep the steps, swap out the water jugs, test the lantern, oil the fan crank. It's a social thing as much as a chore. Patrice brings her cinnamon rolls. Del Suggs, who is 80-something and has been cranking that fan since Eisenhower, sits on the bottom step and tells the same stories. Kids run up and down the stairs until somebody tells them to quit. I went because I always go, because showing up is the thing I do, and because being asked to help with the shelter felt like another small door opening, another inch of belonging earned. We swept, and we restocked, and somebody made a joke about how the water jugs were older than Cody, and the whole thing was so warm and so ordinary that when I think about it now, I get a kind of vertigo, because all the people who would later frighten me most were down there that morning being lovely, and the loveliness was real. That's the part nobody believes when I try to tell it. The kindness was never fake. The kindness was the most real thing about them. The kindness was what was left. I found the notebook because I'm the kind of person who tidies other people's spaces without being asked. There was a metal cabinet bolted to the wall near the fan, the kind of gray cabinet you'd find in any school or church basement, and inside it were the spare batteries and a first aid kit, and a stack of old hymnals nobody had touched in years, and underneath the hymnals, a spiral notebook, water warped along the bottom edge so the cover curled like a dead leaf. I almost put it in the trash bag with the expired water and the dead flashlights. I flipped it open the way you flip open anything before you throw it away, just to be sure, and the first page I landed on was a list of names in a column, maybe 20 of them, in 3 or 4 different hands and 3 or 4 different inks with a date at the top, a date in 1991, and beside some of the names, small pencil hash marks, 1s and 2s, and one with 4 little lines and a slash through them. I didn't think anything of it. A shelter log, I figured. Who came down for which storm? The kind of record a careful town keeps. I flipped back, and there were more pages, more dates. Going back and back, the ink getting older and the paper getting browner. Names I didn't know, and then, on a page from the 80s, names I did. I started to put it back, and then I didn't, and I genuinely cannot tell you why. I told myself I'd add it to the supply inventory. I slipped it into my tote bag with the emptothermos, and I climbed up out of the cold into the bright March morning where Patrice was handing out cinnamon rolls, and I ate one standing in the sun, and the notebook sat in my bag against my hip the whole drive home, and that was the last completely ordinary day of my life. Though of course it didn't feel like one. It felt like Saturday. I read it that night at the kitchen table after Theo went to bed. He goes to bed early, Theo. He's an up-with-the-sun man, and I'm a night person, so the late kitchen is mine. I had a glass of wine in the notebook, and I went through it page by page, front to back, the way I go through everything, because I'm thorough, because thoroughness is another way of showing up. The earliest dated page was 1953. The latest was just 2 years ago. Every page was a storm I figured out, a date, and then the names of everyone who'd sheltered. Some pages had 4 or 5 names. Some had 40, the bad years you could feel. There'd be 3 storms in a single spring. 3 pages close together, the handwriting hurried. And on most of the names, those hash marks in pencil added later, it looked like, in a different pressure than the names themselves. I sat there trying to make the hash marks mean something. Visits, maybe, times you'd come down. But that didn't work, because some people who appeared on 20 pages had only 1 or 2 marks, and some who appeared once had 5. I told myself it was a tally of something boring. Donations to the supply fund, volunteer hours, the kind of thing a small town tracks in a spiral notebook, because that's how small towns track things. Then I found Theo. He was on a page from 1996, which would have made him 8 years old. Theo James Hale in a child's careful blocky print, like he'd been told to write his own name so he'd learn his letters in an emergency the way they make kids do. And beside it, 2 hash marks. And I sat with that, my husband's 8-year-old hand on a brown page, and the wine going warm, and for the first time I felt the floor tilt, just slightly, just enough to notice, because there was nothing wrong with an 8-year-old's name in a shelter log. Of course he'd sheltered as a boy. Of course his mother had brought him down. There was nothing wrong with it at all. And yet I turned the page very slowly, the way you'd back away from a dog you weren't sure about, and I kept reading, and the wrongness didn't have a shape yet. It was just a tilt, just the green electric feeling of weather coming when the sky is still clear. What finally made the tilt into something I couldn't set down was the dates. There were names on early pages, pages from the 60s, the 70s that belonged to people I knew, living people, not their grandparents, not their namesakes, them. Del Suggs was on a page from 1961 in handwriting that was clearly Del's, the same cramped hand he uses now to label the casserole dishes so they get back to the right house. And 1961 was fine, Del's old. Del could have been a young man in 1961. But Patrice was on a page from 1968, Patrice Hale in her round looping cursive, the same cursive that fills the church bulletin every week. And in 1968, Patrice would have been, I did the math twice, 3 years old, 4 at the most. And the handwriting was not a child's. It was the handwriting she has now. Adult confont the P with its little flourish. I sat at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning, looking at my mother-in-law's grown woman's signature on a page dated when she was a toddler, and the cut grass smell came into my kitchen with all the windows shut. I want to be careful here because this is the part where, if I'm not careful, you'll think I'm telling you a ghost story, and I'm not, or not the kind you mean. The smell came in, green and sharp and electric, ozone and crushed stems, the smell of the plains before a storm, except it was a clear cold March night, and the windows were shut, and the storm door was latched, and there was no storm anywhere within 200 miles. I checked the radar on my phone. I checked it twice. The smell came in, and it sat in my kitchen for about as long as it took my heart to climb up into my throat. And then it went, the way a draft goes, and I was alone with the notebook and the dead wine, and my husband asleep down the hall, in the house he'd grown up 2 streets over from. I closed the notebook. I did not throw it away. I put it in the drawer where we keep the takeout menus and the spare keys, and I went to bed and I did not sleep. And in the morning Theo buttered his toast and the sky was clear and I said nothing, because what was there to say? Your mother signed a book before she was born, and my kitchen smelled like a thunderstorm. You don't say that to a man over breakfast. You wait, you watch, you show up and you keep your eyes open, which is the only thing I have ever really known how to do. I tried it on Patrice first gently, the way you'd test a step you weren't sure would hold. I went over on a Tuesday with a loaf of the banana bread she likes, and I helped her. Tomatoes, and I said real casual, drying my hands. I found an old notebook down in the shelter on clean-out day, looks like a log going way back. Did you know your name's in there from the 60s? And Patrice didn't even pause. She kept pressing soil around a seedling with her thumbs, and she smiled and she said, oh, that old thing, everybody's in that. We've kept it forever. You're in it too, on. And then she stopped, just a half-second hitch, and corrected herself. Well, you will be. We'll get you in there. And she looked up at me with so much warmth it hurt. The warmth I'd cried over that first Thanksgiving, and she said, we always make room. And she went back to her tomatoes. We always make room. I'd heard her say it 100 times. About the dinner table, about the church pew, about the shelter when the bad weather came and somebody's cousin showed up from out of town. We always make room. It's a kind thing to say. It's the kindest thing a town can say to a starving girl from Tulsa. It is also, I would come to understand, the most exact description of what was happening to all of us, and she was telling me the truth to my face the whole time, the way kind people do, never lying, never once lying, just answering the question I'd actually asked with a tenderness that kept me from hearing it. I told Marisol because Marisol was the one person I could tell. She'd moved to Garnett 4 years before me from Albuquerque, married to a man who managed the grain elevator, and she was the only other woman in my circle who hadn't been born within the sound of those sirens. We had that between us, the outsider thing, the way you can roll your eyes at a casserole culture you also secretly love. I brought the notebook to her kitchen, and I showed her the Patrice page, and I watched her do the math the way I had. And she got the same little crease between her eyebrows, and she said, that's weird, Ren. That's genuinely weird. And for a second I had a partner in it, and the relief was enormous. But then I asked her about the big storm, because everyone in town referenced the big storm, the one in, I thought, the early 2000s, the one that took out the whole block where the Sonic is now, the one that people called the Miracle. And Marisol's face did something I didn't have a name for yet. She started to tell me about it. She said, oh, the big one. That was before No, wait, I was here for that. We went down, all of us went down, and it was, she stopped, and she smiled. A soft, pleasant, faraway smile, the smile you smile remembering a good vacation. And it was fine, she said. We were all fine. Everybody made it. And I said, but what was it like down there for those hours? And Marisol kept that soft smile and said, I don't really, it's funny. I can't quite. And then she laughed and shook her head and said it was a long time ago, and reached for the kettle, and the conversation was over. She had been in that shelter for what people said was 9 hours during the worst tornado in the county's history, and the middle of the memory was simply gone, sanded smooth, and where it should have been there was a warm, pleasant nothing, the feeling you have about a thing you're glad happened but can't recall. I went home that night and wrote down in my own notebook, the one I'd started keeping, the one I still have. Marisol can't remember the storm, but she's happy about it. I underlined happy. Cody was the one who said the thing out loud that I'd been circling. Cody is Patrice's great-nephew, 16, sharp as a tack and twice as prickly, the kind of teenager who's smarter than the adults around him and knows it, and is bored half to death by a town that thinks a softball game is the major event. I'd always liked him because he reminded me of me at that age, all elbows and suspicion. He came by to help Theo with the truck one Saturday, and found me at the kitchen table with the notebook spread out, and my own annotations going, and he leaned over my shoulder and read for a while without asking, the way teenagers will, and then he said, flatly, "You noticed it too." Not a question. I said, "Noticed what?" carefully, and he said, "The old people. How they're all," he searched for the word, "how they're all the same nice. You ever notice that? Dell and Aunt Patrice and old Mister, Vincent and the Coudet sisters, they're all so nice, but it's like the exact same nice, like they all agree about everything, like there's nobody home doing the agreeing." And I felt the floor tilt again, harder this time, because he'd put his finger right on the thing I hadn't let myself look at directly. They were all the same nice. The kindest people in town were kind in an identical way, a frictionless way, a way with no edges and no preferences underneath it. Cody said, I asked Uncle Del what his favorite kind of pie was once, and he said, "Whatever everybody else is having." Who says that? Everybody's got a favorite pie. And he didn't say it like it was deep. He said it like it bugged him. And then Theo called him out to the truck and he went, and I sat there with my heart going, because for the first time someone else had seen it, and he was 16 and I was already afraid for him without knowing why. So I started watching for it, the absence of preference, and once you see it, you can't stop. Del Suggs ate whatever was put in front of him with the same mild pleasure, every time, no favorites, no dislikes. I tested it. I brought him a slice of the lemon icebox pie that everyone said his late wife used to make, the recipe Patrice has supposedly gotten from her, and I said, "Del, isn't this Ruth's recipe?" And he said, "Oh, that's a good pie. That's a real good pie," and ate it with the exact mild pleasure he'd have given a slice of white bread. And there was nothing in his face, nothing. No Ruth in it at all, just the town's general fondness for pie wearing Del's face. I asked him once, point blank, what Ruth had been like. His own wife, dead 12 years. And he thought about it and he said, "Oh, she was a wonderful woman. Everybody loved her. She did so much for the church." And every word of that was the town's eulogy, the public Ruth, the Ruth of the bulletin. There was no private Ruth in there. There was no morning she'd burned the toast and laughed, no fight they'd had and made up from, no smell of her hair. 12 years a widower, and what he had left of his wife was the same thing the whole town had, the public fond consensus, as if his own grief had been quietly withdrawn from him and replaced with everyone's, and he was happy. That was the unbearable part. Del Suggs was a happy, gentle, beloved old man, and there was almost nothing left inside him that was only his, and he didn't miss it, because the missing was the first thing to go. I went looking for the records of the big storm, the real ones, the county ones, because I needed something with a date and a number on it that wasn't in anyone's notebook. I found it at the library in Pahuska on microfilm, the county paper, and the storm was real, all right. An F4, they'd graded it later, a direct hit on the south end of Garnett in May of 2003, a mile-wide wedge that came up out of the southwest at supper time and walked straight through the block where the Sonic is now, except the Sonic wasn't there then. Then it was houses, 11 houses, and the photographs were the photographs you've seen from every tornado. The slab swept clean the tree with a 2x4 driven through it, the car in the second-story bedroom of a house across the street, the whole block gone. And the headline I sat in front of for a long time in that quiet microfilm room, the headline said, "Garnett spared, not one life lost. Not one. 11 houses reduced to their foundations, a town in the direct path of a mile-wide F4, and not one person hurt." The paper called it a miracle. The pastor was quoted calling it a miracle. The governor sent a letter calling it a miracle. And I sat there and I felt the whole thing turn over in my hands like a coin, because I had been reading a notebook that told the same story from the other side. Not one life lost. Of course not. The shelter doesn't take lives. That was the thing I'd had backwards from the first night. I'd been reading the list as a record of who'd died, and looking for the deaths and not finding them and feeling crazy. But it was never a list of the lost. It was a list of the kept. Everyone on those pages survived. Everyone on those pages went down into the cold, and the storm came and stepped right over them, and they all walked back up into the daylight, alive, every single time for 70 years, in the most tornado-battered county, in the most tornado-battered state in the country. Not one life lost ever. And the price of that, the price that the hash marks were counting, was paid afterward, slowly in installments, in the only currency a person has that a town can spend, themselves. I understood it then, or I understood enough of it. Sitting in the library in Pahuska with the microfilm light humming, nobody told me. I want to be clear about that, because I think you're waiting for the part where some old-timer sits me down and explains the rules the way it always goes, and that part never came, because there was nobody to explain it. The people who could have explained it were the people it had already taken, and you can't explain a thing with the part of you that's been removed for not noticing. There was no keeper of the secret. There was no villain in a back room. There was just a town that had made an arrangement so long ago that the arrangement had become indistinguishable from the town's own goodness, and a notebook that kept account because somebody, generations back, had been the kind of careful person who keeps account, and a green smell that came when the arithmetic needed balancing. I assembled it myself out of the dates and the hash marks and Dell's missing wife and Marisol's missing 9 hours, and what I assembled was partial, and it stayed partial, and I'm telling you it's still partial now. Because the only way to know the whole of it is to pay the whole of it, and the people who've paid the whole of it can't tell you anything that isn't a casserole recipe and a kind word. The hash marks were payments. I was sure of it by then. The number beside your name was how many installments you still owed, or how many you'd made. I could never settle which, and it might be both. It might be that the count goes up as you pay, and the paying is the point, and there's no finish line, just an asymptote you slide down forever until there's no you left to subtract from. Dell had a 5 with a slash through it on a page from the 60s, and a single mark on the most recent. Patrice's marks were everywhere and small. My Theo had his 2 from when he was 8 and nothing since, and I held on to that. I held on to the nothing since like a railing, because it meant that whatever this was, it could go quiet. It could leave a person mostly alone for years. It had left Theo mostly Theo. Gentle, yes, agreeable, yes, a man who'd say whatever's fine, hon, about dinner. But he had preferences. He had a favorite Thunder player and a grudge against his high school baseball coach, and a specific way he liked his coffee. He was in there. My husband was still in there for now. 2 marks as a boy. I told myself the storm in 2003 had come when he was away at his cousin's in Bartlesville, and I'd checked, and it was true, he had been, and so the big one had passed over Theo, and Theo was the proof that you could live your whole life in Garnett and stay yourself, as long as you were lucky. As long as the wedge came on a weekend you happened to be somewhere else. As long as you never went down. The smell started coming more often. In the kitchen, in the car, once in the cereal aisle of the Dollar General, with the fluorescent lights buzzing and a Garth Brooks song. Speakers, the green electric storm smell rising up around me with the sky outside flat and white and harmless. It came whenever I got close to understanding something, and it came whenever I got close to Patrice, and I started to think of it not as a warning exactly, but as attention. The way you feel a person's eyes on the back of your neck. The town, or the thing the town had agreed to, or the shelter itself reaching up through the soil. Something had noticed me noticing, and it was not angry. That's what I want you to understand. It was never angry, it didn't chase me or threaten me or move objects in the night. It just turned its mild, enormous patient attention toward me and breathed its green breath into my rooms and waited, the way the whole town waited, the way Patrice waited with her tomatoes, certain and unhurried and warm, because they had all the time in the world and I was already, slowly, walking toward the only door there was. Because here's the thing I have to tell you about myself, the thing I figured out around the same time I figured out the hash marks. It wanted me in whatever way a thing like that can want, but it didn't have to take me, it only had to offer. Patrice came to me one evening in April, on my own porch, with a slice of pie and the spiral notebook under her arm, and she sat down next to me in the gold light, and she put the notebook in her lap, and she opened it to a fresh page, and she said, "Ren, honey, I want to get you in the book before the season really gets going. Storm season. You and Theo both. But Theo's already in from when he was little, so just you. It'll only take a second. We always make room." And she had a pen ready. And I looked at that blank line, waiting for my name, in the same notebook that held 4 generations of this town, that held Theo at 8 years old, that held Patrice before she was born, and I felt, God help me, I felt it rise up in me like the green smell, the want, the old starving want, the want I'd carried from Tulsa. The want that had driven me to organize every meal train and keep every spare key. The want to finally be written in, to be on the list, to be counted, to be one of the names that the town keeps, to belong completely. She was offering me the exact thing I had wanted my entire life, and I knew precisely what it cost, and I sat on my own porch in the gold light, and I almost said yes. My mouth was already moving. I want you to know how close it was. The only thing that stopped me was that the smell came right then, green and electric and triumphant, before I'd even decided, like it already knew. Like the wanting was enough and the saying was a formality, and the wrongness of that it was glad before I'd chosen, was the cold water that woke me up. I said, "Can I think about it?" And Patrice's face didn't fall, didn't flicker, stayed warm as bread, and she closed the notebook and patted my knee and said, "Course you can, hon. No hurry, we always make room," and she left the pie. And I sat there shaking after she'd gone, because I'd felt how badly the part of me that had been alone my whole life wanted to sign, and how that part of me did not care what it cost, because being alone is its own kind of being slowly subtracted, and at least this way you got the warmth on the way down. Marisol was going. I could see it now that I knew what to look for, and watching it happen to my friend was the worst part of that whole spring, worse than the smell, worse than Patrice's pen. It happened in increments I can date because I wrote them down. In early April, she still rolled her eyes with me about the casserole culture. By the middle of the month, she said, about a church potluck. "You know, I used to think this was so much, all this food, but really, isn't it nice the way we all just—" And she didn't finish, and she smiled the soft faraway smile, and a thing that had been ours, the little shared irony of two outsiders, was just gone from her, smoothed over, and she didn't know it was gone. By the end of April, she said we always make room to me, about a new family that had moved in on Magnolia, and she said it without quotation marks, without irony, the way Patrice said it, as a blessing, and I went home and wrote it down and underlined it and put the date, and I sat at my kitchen table and cried, because I understood that my friend was being spent and there was nothing I could do, and worse, that she was happy, that every increment of Marisol that disappeared took with it the part of her that might have minded, so that the process felt to her, from the inside, exactly like settling in, like finally belonging, like the thing I wanted. There'd been a small storm at the end of March. Nothing much, a wall cloud and a warning, and an hour in the shelter, the whole neighborhood down there playing cards by lantern light, and Marisol had been down for it. And afterward there was one more mark beside. Her name I checked. One more small pencil mark, fresh, beside Marisol's name on a page she'd been added to 2 years before, the page where her own first descent was recorded, the big storm she couldn't remember, and the new mark was the first installment on the new storm. And she came up out of that shelter in March a little kinder, and a little smoother, and a little less herself, and she thought she felt great. Cody folded in the same storm. That's the one that broke something in me, because Cody was the one who'd seen it. Cody was my witness. Cody had said they're all the same, nice with his own prickly, suspicious 16-year-old mouth, and the family had gone down for that 1 hour in March, the whole bunch of them, Patrice and Cody and Dell cranking the fan, and Cody came up different, not dramatically, just softer. The next time I saw him, he helped me carry groceries in without being asked, which the old Cody would never have done. And when I tried to catch his eye about the notebook, when I said quietly, "Hey, you remember what you said about the old people being the same nice?" He looked at me with a pleasant puzzlement, and he said, "Did I say that?" And then he smiled, an easy, untroubled smile that had never once crossed that kid's face in all the time I'd known him, and he said, "They're good people, Aunt Wren. They do a lot for everybody." And he went to put the milk away, and I stood in my kitchen holding a bag of oranges and understood that my only ally was gone, that the storm had taken the part of him that found things wrong, which is the most useful part of a person, and the first part a town like this would want to spend, and that I was alone in it now in a way I had not been alone since Tulsa, since before my father died, since before any of it. Just me and the notebook and the green smell and a husband who buttered his toast, and a thing under the ground that had all the time in the world and was patient with me, the way you're patient with a child who hasn't yet realized. The party is for her. It came for real on a Saturday in May. Of course it did. They always come at supper time in May, the bad ones, the wedges, when the heat of the day has built all afternoon, and the dry line sharpens out west and the whole sky goes the color of a bruise. The sirens went at noon like always, the test, the long ordinary wail nobody flinches at, and Theo buttered nothing because it was lunch, but he stood at the window a second longer than usual and said, "Weather later maybe, the way men out here can read the sky," and went back to his sandwich. And the afternoon got hot and still and yellow, the stillness that isn't peace, the stillness of a held breath, and around 5 the wind died completely and the birds quit. and the light went that sick gold green, and the cut grass smell rose up off every lawn in town mixed with the ozone coming in from the southwest, the green electric storm smell, the best smell in the world, Patrice's favorite smell, my own private dread rolling over Garnett thick as water. And at 5:40 the sirens went again, and this time it was not a test. You can't tell the difference in the sound. That's the whole horror of the sound, that the warning and the test are identical, that the worst thing wears the most ordinary voice. But you can tell the difference in the sky, and the sky was wrong. The sky was a wall coming, a black-green wall in the southwest with a lowering underneath it that was already starting to turn. And Theo had the weather radio on, and the man's voice was saying the words you never want to hear. Confirmed on the ground, large and destructive, in the town of Garnett, and take shelter now. We went. Of course we went. You go. Theo had the truck running before I'd found my shoes, and we drove the 4 blocks to 2nd and Cedar through air that had gone the color of healing bruise, and the whole neighborhood was converging on the annex, headlights on in the afternoon, people half running across lawns with their kids and their dogs, and I saw Patrice already at the top of the shelter steps holding the door, holding the heavy steel door open against the wind, waving people down, her gray hair whipping, her face calm and warm and absolutely certain, and I heard her over the wind and the siren. I heard her call out to the Kudai sisters and to the new family from Magnolia and to all of us. Streaming toward the dark, I heard her call out, come on down, we always make room." And Theo took my hand and started toward the steps, and Marisol was already down there. I could see her at the bottom turning to look up for me with that soft smile, and Dell was at the fan, and Cody was guiding the little kids down ahead of him, and the wall in the southwest had a roar coming off it now, a freight train roar that everyone always says and that turns out to be exactly true. And Theo pulled my hand and said, "Ren, come on," and I stopped. I stopped on the concrete steps with my husband's hand in mine and the storm a half-mile out and the whole town I'd starved my whole life to belong, to calling me down into the cold where I would be safe, where I would be kept, where not one life is ever lost, and I understood with total clarity what I was choosing between. I could let go of Theo's hand and turn around and stand in the open, in my own yard, 4 blocks away and meet the wedge as myself, whole, every memory and preference and edge of me intact and probably die, because that's what happens to people who stand in the open when an F4 comes through, and the notebook would not get my name because you can't keep what won't come down. Or I could go down the steps into the dark and live and begin, that very hour to be spent, to be smoothed, to be made into one more frictionless beloved instrument of the town's perfect kindness, paying my first installment before the all clear even sounded, becoming over the coming years a woman who eats whatever's put in front of her, and remembers her husband as a wonderful man everybody loved, happy the whole way down, never once missing what was taken because the missing goes first. Those were the choices. Keep myself and lose everything, or keep everything and lose myself. And the storm was coming and there was no third door, and Theo's hand was warm in mine, and his eyes were scared, scared for me, my gentle husband with his 2 boyhood hash marks, and he said my name again, just my name, Ren, and I want to tell you I made the brave choice. I want so badly to tell you I let go and turned and met the storm as myself, but I have told you from the start what I am. I went down. I went down because I show up. I went down because I could not stand in my own yard and let Theo and Marisol and Cody and Patrice and the Kudahi sisters and the new family from Magnolia be down in the dark without me. Could not be the one who stayed up top and alone while everyone I loved went into the cold together. Could not, in the last accounting, bear to be left out of the shelter one more time in a life that had been one long ache of being left out. The thing under the ground had not had to take me. It only had to wait and offer and let me be exactly who I had always been. I went down the steps, and Patrice pulled the steel door shut above us and threw the bolt, and the roar became a pressure in my ears, and then a great grinding overhead, and Dell cranked the fan, and the bare bulb swung, and the lantern threw our shadows huge on the curved concrete ceiling. And we sat close on the bolted benches in the cold 60 of us, knee to knee, and Theo put his arm around me, and Marisol reached over and took my other hand, and somewhere a child started to cry, and 3 mothers shushed it at once in the same soft voice, and the storm walked over Garnett. It missed the house. It missed every house on Cedar and 2nd and Magnolia. It came up out of the southwest, a mile wide, and it walked through the town, the way it had walked through in 2003, and when Patrice finally threw the bolt back, and we climbed up into the strange green stillness after, the annex stood, and the church stood, and our house 4 blocks away stood with not a shingle gone, and somewhere south, where nobody much lived now, there was a swept slab and a tree with a board through it, and the radio would say it again by nightfall, the word, the miracle, Garnett spared, not one life lost, and the casseroles would start arriving within the hour because that is what this town does. That is the thing it is genuinely, truly good at, taking care of its own, and I stood in my own front yard, in the gold-wrecked light of the afterstorm, and I felt it. I want to describe it exactly because it is the whole horror, and there is nothing else to it. No monster in the doorway. No figure at the foot of the bed, just this. I felt at home. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, perfectly, bottomlessly at home. Held, included, counted, one of the kept, and the relief of it was so total that I started to cry standing in my yard. And Theo thought it was the storm and held me. And Patrice came across the grass with a dish towel still in her hand and folded both of us into her arms and said, "See, honey, we made it, we always do," and I felt the warmth close over me like water over a dropped stone. And somewhere underneath the warmth, very faint, getting fainter, a small clear part of me was screaming, and I could feel that part beginning to smooth, beginning to settle, beginning to not mind, and the not minding felt like peace. The not minding felt like finally. The not minding felt exactly like belonging, because that is what it is, that is what it has always been. The difference between the two is the thing they take first. The notebook was on the kitchen table when we went inside. I don't know how it got there. Patrice had had it at the shelter, and now it was on my table, open to the page for that day's storm, May the date, 60 names in 3 different hands. And I went to it the way you go towards something you've decided about without deciding, and I looked for my name to see if it was there yet, and it was. It was there in the column with all the others. Wendy Okafor Hale in ink. In my own handwriting, the same handwriting I'm using to keep this record that I no longer fully understand the purpose of, my own hand, and I did not remember writing it, and I stood there a moment with the green smell all around me, and Theo running the tap in the next room, and the casseroles already coming up the walk, and the small clear screaming part of me had gone very quiet now, almost gone, almost peaceful, and I picked up the pencil that was lying in the crease of the notebook, and beside my own name, in my own hand, without deciding to, without choosing it, the way you breathe, the way you settle into a warm bath, the way you finally stop being alone, I made one small mark. And I have to tell you, the last clear thing I can tell you, the thing the rest of me is already forgiving and forgetting and folding gently away, is how good it felt not to mind.